Hoo boy, Silent Hill. This is a video that I've been wanting to make for a very, very long time. In fact, ever since I put out the first Resident Evil remake video I did, I've kind of wanted to do a Silent Hill video. But I waited on it because the timing never really felt quite right, but here we are. Finally, Silent Hill 1. Originally, I had the intention of making this video about 25 to 30 minutes long, you know, the regular length of a video, that a video should be at least. But as you can see, it's a bit longer than that. I foolishly thought that I wouldn't really have much to say about Silent Hill 1, but hey, turns out I actually have a lot of things to say about this game. So sit back, relax, enjoy, and enjoy however long this video ends up being. I have no idea. Strap in. Silent Hill isn't really something that I would consider to be a niche franchise anymore. Social media has been a bigger marketing push for this series than anything that Konami had ever managed to do in the past. And to be honest with you, I think that most people who are campaigning for a return to this series in some form have probably not played the bulk of this franchise. But at least now, most people are aware of what Silent Hill actually is. But I'm not sure that most people know how this series actually plays. But before we get into the meat of this video, let me give you an introduction to my introduction to Silent Hill. When I was younger, I never really played horror games. My older brothers were never really into survival horror games or anything like that, so I never really had the opportunity to pinch Resident Evil 2 and give that a go for an evening. Granted, a 5-year-old should probably not be playing Resident Evil 2, but I'm sure there are quite a lot of you that did that. Still though, I can't help but feel like I missed out on a lot of horror game experiences as a kid. I don't really have any of those stories that you might hear from someone who snuck into their parents' bedroom or brother's bedroom and took a look at their games and picked out the wrong one to play for an evening. So when I realized that there was an entire subgenre of games that I had not yet discovered, what did I do? Well, I went to YouTube and watched Let's Plays. And this is where I first discovered the Silent Hill series. And when you first see footage of Silent Hill, there is something so distinctly different about it, even in comparison to other survival horror games. The vibe that Silent Hill gives off is just different to a lot of other horror games. And I think that the key difference between this franchise and other horror franchises is the way that Silent Hill warps and distorts the things that we are very familiar with. Like a small rural town that should not be as ominous as it's presented in the game. The game even uses sounds to make you alert to things that aren't even there, making you painfully aware of the crushing soundscape. And the best part of it all is that Silent Hill is a horror game that rarely uses jump scares to frighten the player. Though they are still there and yeah, they work. The first Silent Hill feels less cinematic than the fixed camera angles of Resident Evil, yet at that same time, it feels so much more dynamic and frantic. Silent Hill 1 didn't make use of pre-rendered background stills. It instead rendered its entire environment in 3D, making the world feel alive and ever-present. This also meant that Silent Hill could approach things a bit differently to Resident Evil. It could actually make use of darkness to obscure enemies and items that the player needed to get to progress. None of this is to say that Resident Evil is an inferior franchise, it's just important to take note of all of the things that Silent Hill did differently. It's important to note just how different of an experience the first Silent Hill game is. The first Silent Hill game is a particularly interesting game in the world of survival horror, as it was one of the first titles to really shake up the status quo that had been established by Resident Evil. Instead of a layered mansion with a very structured method of exploration, the game presents you with a town, a map, and a goal. You're free to explore the town and often have to just aimlessly wander around in order to figure out where to go next, with your map slowly becoming full of scribbles and notes that show you where you can and can't go, lending a strange sort of satisfaction to finding dead ends and secrets as your journey becomes noted down. Silent Hill is a game that plays with your mind and manages to scare you with things that aren't even there. Silent Hill is a masterclass in building tension that never gets relieved. The droning ambience, combined with the suffocating fog, create a world that is far more ambient and nerve-wracking than any spooky mansion or castle. And again, not to say that those settings are measurably worse than Silent Hill, but it's just to illustrate the point that Silent Hill is such a different experience. The fear in Silent Hill is tangible, it's familiar, it's ever-present, but Silent Hill takes that familiarity and uses it as its greatest weapon. The game was released in 1999, developed by Team Silent, a group of developers that were a part of Konami at the time. Development began in 1996 when Konami had asked the team to create a game that would appeal to the Western market and possess a Hollywood-like atmosphere. Whatever that means. No doubt to try and cash in on the sudden success of Capcom's own major release. Team Silent went through many iterations and concepts before deciding to scrap these ideas and Konami's limitations, deciding to instead focus on creating a title that would toy with the player's fears and emotions in a way that no game had done before. Team Silent used many ideas and concepts that could be found throughout the horror genre in their games, from story motifs to smaller references that can be found in the environment. There are so many little nods and tributes to famous works of horror in Silent Hill. There are entire lists comprised of all these details. It's something that you will very likely not notice on a first playthrough, but it's a really cute thing to see. A lot of the inspirations that Team Silent had found were not necessarily in mainstream horror titles, but instead in the works of directors like David Lynch. And yeah, I mean, David Lynch is fucking weird, so it makes sense. At release, many critics did exactly the same as I did at the start of this video. They compared the game to Resident Evil. See? I got you. Mind, I don't blame them, since that was really the only other comparable title that had come out at that time. But that cements just how much of a hit Resident Evil actually was. And I'm sure that for some, Silent Hill would always feel like a franchise that was playing catch-up. Which is funny, because as much as I love Resident Evil, and I do love Resident Evil, there are aspects of Silent Hill that I outright prefer and think outclass Resident Evil in many ways. Critically speaking, Silent Hill did very well with critics though, getting 8s and 9s across the board. It also sold well enough to greenlight a sequel, though pretty small game. I'm not really sure if many of you have heard of it. Silent Hill was also one of the very first 3D third-person survival horror games to be released, and I'm sure there are other games that technically can hold that title. I'm looking at you, Overblood, because you fucking suck. And I mean, yeah, the stuff that this game does with the lighting and the general aesthetic works so well. It's interesting too, because Konami was on a roll in making games that looked and performed very, very well. Metal Gear Solid also comes to mind, and while I think that game aged far worse, it's still impressive in its own right. And before anyone starts with, oh, you don't like Metal Gear? Metal Gear is my favorite franchise of all time, right? So just fuck off. Technically speaking, I think that the game holds up extremely well, given that it's a fully 3D PlayStation 1 title, though I will also say that the way I'm playing the game is helping a lot too. I'm playing this game on the DuckStation emulator, and my god, it does so much to make this game look so good. By using the geometry correction feature, you can stop the textures and the models from having that trademark PlayStation 1 warping. You can also play the game in widescreen, but for the purposes of this video, I've left it in its original 4:3 ratio to retain that classic look. Being able to truly see the detail in the character models and the environments without the jaggedness of the original console really manages to pump this game with a breath of fresh air. So if you have this as an option, I would 100% recommend using DuckStation to play the game, as it gets rid of almost all of the problems that could be attributed to age, as far as I'm concerned. But really, now, we come to the ultimate question. Is Silent Hill still worth playing right now? Yes. Yes, the answer is yes, by the way. And does the game still manage to be a chilling and frightening experience all these years later? The answer is also yes. I think so. But really, it's a hard question to answer, since it does come down to your taste in survival horror games. Silent Hill is undoubtedly an experience that won't really appeal to everyone, but today, we're going to be talking about why I think Silent Hill is still a game that you need to experience. Also, full spoilers, I'm spoiling the entire game. The entire game's going to be cracked wide open like a little pig. Oh, that's quite visceral image, right? Take it back. That's not like a pig, not like a pig. Whoa. The very beginning of Silent Hill starts out in a pretty snazzy way, with the CG opening movie showing a montage of different, seemingly random events. It's pretty difficult to understand this on the first couple of viewings, or I don't know, I could be a moron, I mean, who's counting? Where it's actually showing us the various events leading up to the game, with our protagonist Harry Mason finding a little girl called Cheryl on the side of the road. Then we see images of another girl, a home, and various other characters looking pretty shady in their own right. These models have a real sort of uncanny valley feeling to them, and not necessarily in a good or bad way. Dahlia in particular just looks so fucking creepy in some shots, which perfectly represents her portrayal in the game, but we'll get to that later on. Plus, some animations look kinda janky, but again, it's all in a spooky kind of way, and yeah, I just really like that sort of approach. They were also all done by one guy. Takayoshi Sato had made all of the CG cutscenes in the game over the course of 2.5 years. There were also complications with his superior about him being credited for his work, so here you go, bud. Good job, they still look really weird. The music here in the intro is also great and starts the trend of Silent Hill games having very good music in their intro sequences. And while the soundtrack in this game may not be as present as it is in other titles, Akira Yamaoka did a great job with the songs here. The intro caps off with Harry driving along the highway, seeing a cop on a bike, seeing the bike mysteriously without the cop, and finally a girl appears on the road, causing Harry to desperately try to swerve out of the way, which ends up with his car flying off the road. After waking up and being unable to find Cheryl, we are thrust into gameplay on the fog-soaked streets of Silent Hill. In contrast to the opening's somber yet weirdly inviting soundscape, these streets are another story entirely. The only sounds you hear are the wind and the unsettling soundtrack echoing in the background. Right away, the tone of the game is almost suffocating, in a good way. You really feel like you're there along with Harry, and it's also a good time to bring up how great this game looks to this day. This game looks fantastic for what it is, so be sure to thank the power of emulation and anime. Harry spots Cheryl just up ahead and we're tasked with running after her. This eventually leads to an alleyway and straight away, you are greeted with a Jesus Christ! I feel like for most horror games it takes a while before you see something like this, but Silent Hill just says, hey, I heard you like grotesque piles of indiscernible meat chunks. The ambience here is amazing, especially with the really strange groaning sounds in the music. As Harry proceeds through the alleyway, you begin to hear the distant sounds of an old war siren. Though to this day, I'm not sure why, but I might have a theory on that. We'll try to come back to it later. Then the camera shifts quickly and strangely, almost as if you're being watched by something that quickly climbed to the pipes above you, slowly stalking and hunting you as you make your way further down into the alleyway. These camera angle shifts are very cool, and an example of how Team Silent made use of the 3D environment to do things that other horror games couldn't quite manage yet. Though, the camera has its own issues, which we'll get into in a minute. Eventually, the alleyway becomes very dark, and Harry has to light a match to be able to see where he's going. At this point, the music becomes louder, and more mechanical noises start to be heard. Harry comes across a wheelchair whose wheels are spinning all on their own, though Harry doesn't seem to care about that part, as he just thinks it's broken, but alright. Harry, the wheels are spinning on their own! Further ahead, you encounter a dead body on a stretcher covered in blood. And what does Harry have to say about this horrifying sight? What do you think it is, Harry? And then, as the walls begin to close in around you, and the music gets louder and more noises are piled together in the soundscape, you're greeted with the remains of someone that's been gutted and left hanging up on a wall. Again, Harry has some very interesting things to say about this. Out of the darkness, you're attacked by little zombie children wielding tiny knives. They're just so small, they got tiny knives, what are they gonna do? So obviously the only way out is to run, but all the exits are now sealed, and the only thing you can now do is... Harry then wakes up in a small diner and is greeted by a police officer named Sybil. Honestly, how long was she standing there? Harry, obviously in a panic, though you wouldn't fucking know it, wants to go out into Silent Hill and find Cheryl as soon as possible. And I want to just say here that the voice acting is pretty good.
Have you seen a little girl? Just turned 7 last month, short, black hair.
I think that for the most part, the voice work in Silent Hill is pretty good, which is impressive considering the quality of VA back in those days, and considering the voice work in the sequel, but we'll get to that when we get to it. Sybil is an officer from Brams, the next town over, who came to Silent Hill for some reason, but I don't think it's ever really explained. I guess she heard that something weird was happening in Silent Hill or something. Harry notices that the town is empty and covered in a thick fog, but beyond that, he has no real idea about what's happening. Sybil doesn't know what's going on here either, but she gives Harry a gun and leaves the diner to go and call in some help, leaving Harry behind to do some exploration. This is the first enclosed space you get to navigate in the game, and it does a good job at getting you used to navigating a smaller environment. It also gets you used to seeing item pickups dotted around the place. These pickups include a map, torch, health drink, and a knife that you can use to defend yourself. There's also a broken radio in the corner of the room, but it's broken. Item pickups can sometimes be pretty easy to miss in this game due to how well they blend into the background sometimes, but for the most part they're easily distinguishable thanks to the bright colors used for vital items like health and ammo. After investigating all of these different items, you can exit the diner and suddenly hear the previously broken radio produce some static noise. You're then suddenly attacked by a flying bat demon of some kind and have to quickly kill it to progress. The radio is a classic bit of Silent Hill equipment and notifies you of any enemies that are nearby by producing a loud static sound effect, though if you don't want that sound on all the time, you can just turn it off in the item menu. Though this absolutely makes certain areas feel even more unnerving. After killing the flying thing, you're finally introduced to the open world, and yes, I use that term kind of loosely. Silent Hill is a fully explorable town with lots of secrets that you can only find by rummaging around the streets and taking detours. The area you start in is called Old Silent Hill, and is one of the 3 parts of the town that you get to explore. But many of the roads either have dead ends or just have nothing to see really, which is a shame because being able to find an area that isn't explicitly on the path of progression is a really cool feeling. Even if the only reward you get are health items and ammo, it's ultimately a really cool concept that doesn't really stick the landing. Though, for the limitations of the time, it's still very impressive. There are some cool things you can see, which include a rundown convenience store and Harry's car that he crashed at the start of the game. Details like this make the town feel more lived in and real as a whole. Though, is that really a good thing? Not sure I really want to visit this place. This is a good time to talk about the map for a second, and yeah, this is where the limitations of the PS1 can clearly be seen. Most of the names on the map are extremely difficult to read on modern displays. Thankfully, you only really need to look at these red markings to figure out where to go, but for the very few times in the game where you need to go to a specific place that isn't explicitly marked on the map, it can be pretty tricky. One thing that does help though is that it's color-coded to a certain extent. Optional areas of interest are shown in purple, for example, for the first area at least. The second area doesn't do this for some reason, and nor does the third. So what the hell's going on here? When I first played the game, I didn't know you could go into the police station because it wasn't marked in purple. It felt like the first area was very much guiding me towards these purple areas to go and look around and explore for stuff. But for this playthrough, I went everywhere I possibly could, and I actually discovered that you could go into the police station, which was a great feeling, but I think it could have been signposted a lot better. But honestly, why would the police station be completely unlocked anyway? What are they doing? Awful at their job. The map itself, though, has so much character, and I absolutely love the approach that they took with it in this game. The idea that Harry is making notes as he goes along makes the entire experience feel so much more immersive. It also communicates where you haven't been yet in a clear and informative way. It would have been nice if the map showed off save points, or maybe the locations of more involved puzzles, but still, I absolutely love what they did here. I am also going to take this opportunity to bring up the controls of this game, and I know that a lot of people do not like the way that this game feels, but I actually don't mind it at all. These are pretty standard tank controls, but it's weird because they seem to be momentum based. It's hard to explain really, I think you'd really need to play it to get it. The shoulder buttons are used to sidestep, and I honestly never use these. Cool additions, but I don't know, I just prefer to walk normally, I guess. Pressing both of the shoulder buttons allows Harry to do a quick turn, and my god, I wish I knew that sooner. Though, it's not really that quick. It does take a few seconds to actually, get going with it. Perhaps the most interesting thing to me about the controls is the combat. When Harry readies a weapon, he's still able to move around and space himself away from enemies. This is very handy when it comes to certain boss fights and goes a long way to making Harry feel less like a big dumb stupid boat. So yeah, I don't actually mind the controls in this game, and I think they're especially good for a tank-controlled PS1 survival horror game. Now the camera? Well, that's a bit of a different matter, because for the most part it's okay, but sometimes it can get extremely annoying, especially when you move into areas that are much more confined than the town streets. Because it's a 3D camera that moves with Harry, it can often be tricky to assess a room before you're swarmed by enemies. Holding down the left trigger will give you some control over the camera, but you can tell how janky it looks from the footage. It doesn't really feel that great. But anyway, enough with the boring shit, let's get back into the meat of the game. Right now, we have to go back to the alleyway that we saw in the dream, and yeah, I don't think I want to do that, to be honest. And the best part is that you don't have to. If you already know where to go, you can just go do that instead. But if you do go back to the alleyway, you'll find that it's been blocked off for the most part. On the ground is a drawing that was apparently done by Cheryl telling Harry to go to the school, accompanied by a picture that's apparently supposed to be Harry. And well, looks about right, to be honest, but unfortunately, every path to the school is blocked off due to the roads deciding to up and fuck off on holiday, so Harry needs to find a way through. The first clue to solving this problem is at the end of Matheson Street, where you find a note that mentions a doghouse, which is fortunately just up on Levin Street. So after a quick saunter up the road, you can find it pretty easily. Inside, you'll find a key to this house just to the left here, and you're one step closer to the school. But as soon as you get inside the house, you'll find out that you need to find 3 more keys to unlock the back door, the locations of which are handily told to you by a map found right next to the door. This game basically tries as hard as it can to make sure you don't get lost by straight up telling you exactly where to go. And honestly, I can't thank it enough. On a first playthrough, you might start to find it annoying how all of the roads are destroyed except for a couple, though I wouldn't necessarily call these dead ends a waste of time because you can pretty often find a couple of items dotted around the places you walk around. Things like health drinks and ammo aren't exactly rare in this game, but it still feels nice to be rewarded for exploring the town's dead ends. This gameplay section where you're hunting down these 3 keys also has a moment that genuinely fucked me up on my first playthrough. And this is a graphic warning for animal cruelty, so genuinely if you don't want to see that, I would skip like 20 seconds or something. The basketball court area with the dismembered dog's head is seriously messed up, and yeah, I felt that. The detail on the blood of the backboard to insinuate that some sick fuck used this thing as an actual ball is incredibly messed up, and yeah. Good job, Team Silent. You fucking monsters. But apart from that, finding the 3 keys isn't too much of a hassle, so you can head right back to the door and hopefully take a bit of a breather after what might have been a slightly traumatic jog around the block. Now, this segment is an interesting way to start the game because it's trying to acclimatize you to the way it works. There is a large emphasis on exploration and searching the environment for clues and items. What this usually boils down to, though, is a pretty long segment of you just holding up on the D-pad and holding square and switching your brain off for a few minutes. This can be very boring, especially on repeat playthroughs. Frankly, this game has a lot of downtime like that, and yeah, it can be a bit dull sometimes, so I'm not really going to defend that part of the game. But what I will say is that it isn't too much of a problem if you just know where you're going and you can bang it out in a couple of minutes. But anyway, we pass through the door, and before we get too comfortable with our surroundings, the area turns pitch black, completely shifting the vibe of the town from a sort of unnerving place to a full-on amusement park of horror shit. Oh, sorry, we're not actually at the amusement park yet, are we? My bad. After having a nice little jog through the street, Harry eventually gets to the school, and the shift in ambience here is just so good. The sudden silence works so well, and makes the school feel 10 times creepier right away. But there's an entire other level hiding just inside. Midwich Elementary School is the first dungeon in the game, and yes, I'm going to call it a dungeon because that's effectively what it is, and it's going to make sense real soon. It was an interesting choice to make the first exploration-y and puzzly area of the game a school. This isn't a new concept or anything, mind. There's even a Wikipedia page called List of Horror Films Set in Academic Institutions. So yeah, not a new concept, but I can't really think of many games that have done that, to be honest. Examples that come to mind are Dead Space 2's nursery section, and maybe the first Persona game that kind of has the same vibe as this too. In terms of level design, the school is fairly straightforward. There are 2 floors, a basement and a courtyard that you'll need to explore to find the next clue for where Cheryl is. It isn't too tricky or confusing to navigate since it's basically just 2 corridors of rooms in parallel with each other, so you shouldn't really be getting lost or anything. But the very first thing you'll notice is the abundance of locked or broken doors that will get in your way. The school admittedly doesn't really have this problem to a huge degree, but later areas are going to make a big deal of this, so get ready for that. But this is the basic loop of Silent Hill. Run along the corridor full of doors, find out which ones you can enter, and then scour the room for items. Rinse and repeat until you find all the stuff you'll need to leave the area. The loop is simple and often broken up with some short puzzle solving or enemy encounters that help to break up the monotony just a little bit. And I'm not going to stand here and pretend that this gameplay loop is the most groundbreaking thing ever made, because it simply isn't. But it's a simple loop that works really well. So navigating the school isn't really that hard, and the enemies that you'll encounter here are all pretty easy to deal with. There's more of the little kid demons with knives, but you can just run around them if you can't be bothered to deal with them. Or you can just, you know. Immediately, the most striking thing about this area to me is the atmosphere. I'm sure everyone at one point has had to go into their school after hours, and I'm sure I'm not alone in thinking how terrifying an empty school at nighttime can feel. Just having these large open spaces that are completely silent and these pitch black hallways really brought me back, and not necessarily in a good way, mind you. This area captures the feeling of a school perfectly in my opinion, and it's the perfect place for the game to truly start. Midwich School is also the place where they decide to throw a few jump scares at you. They range from extremely tame stuff like this random ghost child that falls over and disappears, to stuff like hearing sudden crying coming from one of the stalls in the toilet. And then you get the moment in the locker room, and one of the best scares in the area happens. As soon as you enter the room, you hear rustling and bashing coming from somewhere, which leads you to a specific locker that's shaking and desperately trying to get open. And then a cat jumps out, who is then immediately killed off screen. And then when you come back to the locker room later on in the level, the locker is covered in its blood. There are even moments where the music suddenly starts blaring a seemingly random assortment of mechanical sounds and white noise, making you panic at what might be about to happen, even though there's nothing in the room that will happen. Right? The first main puzzle that you'll need to solve in the school revolves around these 3 pages written in blood at the reception. Each page has a fairly cryptic piece of writing attached to it, but it's pretty easy to figure out what they're telling you. The main thing to take note of here is the phrase in quotation marks, as they each tell you the name of a room you need to go to. The alchemy laboratory is actually the chemistry lab. A place with songs and sound refers to the music room, and finally, darkness that brings the choking heat is referring to the boiler room. The times that are written down are also a clue that will tell you that the clock tower is going to be significant for solving the puzzle. So we start off by making our way to the chemistry lab, where we see a statue's hand clutching onto the item we need. Solution's pretty easy though, just head to the lab equipment room and pick up some acid and throw that onto the hand, and it melts away, giving us our first item, the golden medallion. Traveling back to the clock tower and inserting the medallion here will give us access to the next puzzle in the music room. Now, I used to think that this puzzle was extremely difficult, and in some ways I still do. In the music room there is a piano and a poem on the blackboard. The poem describes a group of different birds that are sitting together in different positions. Now, the first time I ever played this game, I was streaming it, and me and the chat both thought that the puzzle was all about taking the first letters of some of the sentences and using them to play an actual song. Like the first letter in those sentences was a note, like F, C, D, whatever the fuck. That was entirely wrong. I honestly don't remember why we thought that was the solution, because in actuality, the puzzle is a lot simpler than that. It's just kind of obtuse. There are 5 broken keys on the piano, and these are the only ones that you need to actually worry about. The poem tells the story of how a bunch of different birds were sitting apart from each other. The solution lies in figuring out how far these birds are in relation to each other and pressing the corresponding keys on the piano. Now, if you have not played this game, that might have sounded very, very confusing to you, but here's how I figured it out when I was replaying the game for this video. The pelican is the first key, so for now, that one can go anywhere. There's no real indication for where that should be. The dove flies beyond the pelican as far as he could, so this is at the far end of the piano. The raven sits higher than the dove, so that's above the second key. The swan glides in next to another bird, and this point I guess, so I just put it next to the third key. Finally, the crow comes in and stops immediately, so naturally this has to be the first broken key on the left, and once you've gotten them all down, hit the keys in that order and you'll get the next medallion. Wait, is that blood on the piano? Has that been there this entire time? Creepy. Anyway, slap the medallion into the other slot in the clock tower, and now we're headed down into the boiler room, where all we have to do is hit a switch. Now we head back to the clock tower, where the small doors here are now unlocked, and inside, well, this is where things start to get a little crazy. Making your way through this small space will chuck you out into the other world, an even more twisted and fucked up version of the school that's essentially in hell. The general layout of the school is pretty much identical, but now everything looks rusted to hell and the floors have been replaced with a steel grate. Now, I personally love the way that the Otherworld looks in this game, as it genuinely makes these environments feel twisted and dark. It's yet another example of how Silent Hill can completely flip the script on you just as you get comfortable with your surroundings, and I love it. The classrooms are a particularly nice touch since they more accurately depict torture rooms, something that will come into play far later on. There's also a lot more in the way of scares, and the atmosphere is a lot more oppressive in general. One of the coolest touches is in the reception. Before, there was a painting depicting a strange door with 2 bodies hung up next to it. Harry even says that it's in bad taste when you interact with it, but in the reception in the Otherworld, the door is actually there and needs to be interacted with in order to progress. The Otherworld is also an excuse for the level design to start getting a bit crazy at points. For example, if you enter the girls' bathroom on the first floor and then exit it, you'll appear on the second floor. This doesn't really matter, but it's a cool moment that psychs you out and starts fucking with you in a cool way, which I like a lot. They also play with this concept of messing around with your spatial awareness in later levels too. But now the goal of the area is to make your way back to the boiler room, but since many of the doors are now locked, it's going to be a little trickier to get back there. Long story short, using a picture card, a pink ball, a shotgun, and a call from your currently lost daughter, you'll eventually make your way back to the boiler room. And straight away, things are very different. You're met with 2 valves and a turnstile that's stopping you from progressing. The idea here is that you turn the valves until the way is clear, and yeah, I don't really have a fancy solution for this. I kind of just turn the valves until it all works and I get lucky. But by doing this, we are introduced to our very first boss fight. Though it really does not have a grand opening, it just puts you in a room and has the guy slowly walking over to you. Though I actually kind of like that a lot. This guy's called the Split Head, by the way, and I know you may be wondering how it got such a catchy name. Well, its head splits. Yeah, this boss fight's fine. It's annoying how it has an attack that insta-kills you, but this game has a checkpoint system so that you can just try the boss again immediately, so really it isn't that big of a deal. Basically, you just shoot it in the mouth when it splits its head, and eventually it'll die. This fight feels like it's supposed to come out of left field, and in that regard, yeah, I guess it works out that way. I do really like how there aren't any music cues or anything to signal its arrival. It's just kind of there and the fight starts. But it's also foreshadowed in a fairy tale book that you can find in the school before the encounter, which is a nice little detail. Plus, it's a neat bit of foreshadowing to a plot point later on in the storyline. I don't know, this encounter's fine, I guess. It doesn't really outstay its welcome, thank God, but this is what I mean by the whole dungeon thing that I mentioned earlier on. Each little dungeon ends with a kinda trashy / mid-boss fight, so yeah. This entire school section actually plays out more like the Great Deku Tree and less like the Raccoon Police Department, to be honest with you. But yeah, boss fights in survival horror games to me are just kind of questionable at most times anyway. Most of the time they're annoying, and there are very few encounters I can think of that are actually fun and engaging. If you have any particular encounters like this that you are fond of in a survival horror game, please let me know. I would love to hear some of your favorite boss fights. I would love to know. But anyway, after the fight, Harry wakes back up in the boiler room from before the other world segment began, and he hears a church bell suddenly ring. The school is also no longer set in the dark and is devoid of any enemies. All of the doors are now locked too, which kind of insinuates that all of what Harry just went through in the school was a dream of some kind or happened in a weird alternate dimension. Which is pretty cool stuff and is just another element of the game that kind of makes you question what's going on. Honestly, it feels pretty good to be back on the streets. It's almost comforting now to see all of the fog instead of the unending pitch black darkness. Now the goal is to head on over to the church located on Bloch Street? Bloch Street? Oh no. So we've got to do some minor backtracking for a second, and while we're here, I just want to say how much I love the animation for when Harry just runs into a wall. Once we arrive at the church, we meet the person who was summoning us, Dahlia Gillespie, the creepiest middle-aged woman in gaming. Dahlia gives us a brief rundown on what's going on, and she even tells us about Cheryl and guides us to the hospital. While she starts talking about random shit, including this funny little line, the path of the hermit concealed by Flauros. Fuck does that mean? Then she gives us a weird looking shit-stained 3D Triforce and walks out of the building. She could have been even slightly more helpful, I'll be honest. The music here is great though. It's been a very long time since we just heard a nice bit of music in this game, and this song is a really nice, mellow tune to listen to while you figure out where to go next. Dahlia also leaves us a key for the drawbridge that will take us to Central Silent Hill, the next major area in the game. But there is still quite a bit to explore in Old Silent Hill too. The gas station is explorable, as well as a handful of places on the streets that have items to find. There's also a couple of other cool things you can get here too, but we'll get into all of that later on. Making your way to the drawbridge control room will get you a few handy items, including a map of the next area in the game. Lowering the bridge using this console here is all you need to do, and then out of nowhere, the quiet ambience is replaced with this loud mechanical backing track. Every time I hear it, it makes me think there's a bunch of enemies on their way, and what can I say, it works. It gets me every time. Central Silent Hill is another large area of the town and features a couple of interesting places. The first being the police station that's right next to the bridge as you exit it. There isn't too much to see here apart from from a few items, but there is some foreshadowing to a future plot point. There's a drug called White Claudia that's apparently being spread around the place. Police here were trying to figure out where it came from. There's also a note that explains how a police officer suddenly died of a heart attack. I can't stress enough how much I love that Silent Hill has these little places for you to explore, but it brings up the problem that I had with the map again. If both the police station and the hospital were marked in red, I feel like you would assume you could go here or the post office too, right? Well, no. For some reason, these are marked in red, but don't matter at all. No idea if this is cut content or something. It just seems like a weird design choice is all. Exploration would have been more engaging and encouraging if the map was better at telling you where things of interest actually are. The design of Central Silent Hill is also weirdly way more open than old Silent Hill. There are far less collapsed roads and dead ends getting in your way. I'm not sure if this is strictly a bad thing, mind, it just seems like a strange bit of inconsistency. It ends up making Central Silent Hill a far less interesting place to explore at the trade of it being far easier and nicer to traverse. The area outside the police station is also home to the weirdest enemy in the game, the Ape Men. I don't think I really need to say anything else, to be honest. They're just fucking weird. I don't like them. They're very strange. So now we have to head over to Alchemilla Hospital, which is only a short walk away. And immediately, the ambience here is striking. It isn't pitch black like the school, and you aren't left in total silence since there is music being played. What this creates is a sense that things are going to play out a little differently here than they did in the school. It almost creates this feeling like something is waiting for you. Like this area hasn't even begun to really become scary and horror-filled yet. In fact, as soon as you walk in the doors, you hear a gunshot. And this moment is brilliant. It makes you wonder who it could be, where it came from, and why they're here. It's also the perfect time to introduce another human character, since the last one we saw was Sybil, who we haven't seen for ages at this point. And the other being the creepy old woman who I'd rather forget, to be honest. The detail here is also really impressive in my opinion, even more impressive than the school. The hospital offers up a completely different feeling from Midwich Elementary, and also reminds me how spooky empty hospitals are. The details of all the posters on the wall, the grungy surfaces, and the dim dark lighting all go toward creating an amazing atmosphere, and one that is entirely unique to this game too. The hazy fog inside the building is clearly a limitation of the PS1, but it still looks really cool. And just up ahead we are introduced to another character, Kaufman, the director of Alchemilla, and one that seems extremely shady right off the bat. He also provides next to no information on the whereabouts of Cheryl, and he very quickly decides to just leave. Well, alright, I'm sure we'll never see him again, and that he'll have no plot relevance after this point. As far as character introductions go, I do like how the majority of people we've met so far feel really weird and kind of hostile. In a lot of other horror games, I'd say that seeing another human being is normally a pretty comforting feeling, but here it feels like they want nothing to do with you, are completely insane, or are too busy to help you out. As soon as Kaufman leaves, the area falls silent once again, and as we leave the room, a low humming sound starts playing. Fuck, I love the ambience in this game so much, and the way it just sounds slightly off-putting, it's so good! There's no dumb B-movie horror tracks playing, though don't worry, I'm still quite partial to those too. And there's nothing that really indicates any kind of particular tone. The subtle creepiness of the backing ambience feels like it's there to simply fuck with you, and I love that. Alchemilla Hospital is also the area where you'll start to notice how many locked doors there are in this game, as you see this pop up every few seconds. But the goal now is to explore the hospital for any clues regarding Cheryl at all, and this is going to take us to many parts of the building and introduce us to a brand new enemy type we'll see in just a second. This is also the first part of the game where you can find something that will influence the ending. In the kitchen, you can find a plastic bottle, and then in Kaufman's office, you'll see a bunch of this red stuff spilled all over the floor. Using the bottle, you can scoop up some of the liquid and make use of it later on. Initially, progressing through Alchemilla is a bit of a simpler process than it was with Midwich Elementary. The first key item you'll find is a basement key, which takes you to the basement, if that wasn't already clear. The basement itself is an area that has its own unique ambience compared to the rest of the hospital, with the droning sounds in the background becoming slightly louder than they were before. The main thing to do down here is turning on the generator so you can make use of the elevators to access the upper floors, but then things start getting weird. To the right of the generator room is the elevator, and you have access to the basement and floors 1, 2, 3. But going up to floors 2 and 3, you'll discover that the doors that lead to other parts of the hospital are locked, and after you go back into the elevator after trying those doors, you'll see a new floor has appeared on the panel. And this change is even reflected in the actual model for the panel in the elevator. I fucking love this. The very first time I played this game, I genuinely thought I was going crazy. It's so good. Moving to this floor will show you a small cutscene of someone entering a shop of some kind, and then you walk out of the elevator and find out you're back in the other world. Now the hospital has the same rusted aesthetics that the school also had in its otherworld state, and the ambience has become a lot darker to match. There's a specific corridor that's just where you enter through a door and are met with a pitch black hallway. The sounds here are creepy, and you've also not really seen any enemies yet, apart from the roaches in the basement. But just up ahead is the next enemy in the game, the nurses. The first glimpse of which you see is here, when you see one hunched over with some kind of growth or parasite on her back. The best part is that it doesn't immediately aggro to you, it just waits there for you to make a move. The music here is also fantastic as it reverts back to those harsh mechanical sounds that, in conjunction with the static on the radio, creates this overwhelming soundscape that Silent Hill manages so well. The first goal for this portion is to collect 4 different colored tablets that depict different kinds of animals for a locked door that's preventing us from accessing half of the second floor. And in order to collect some of these, the game asks you to do some weird things. The weirdest thing being this weird tentacle plant that damages you whenever you go near it. But by finding a blood pack, you can give it something to snack on while you get the item it's guarding, and yeah, it's weird. It's very weird. The hospital is also home to one of the best melee weapons in the game, the hammer, which can be found in the generator room in the basement after you've traveled to the other world. The hammer absolutely wrecks most of the enemies you come into contact with, and is especially good at killing the nurses dotted around the place. I think this is also the point in the game where you'll realize that it's very generous with the amount of healing items and ammo it gives you. I usually make it here with around 10 health drinks and a bunch of first aid kits. Plus I normally have way over 100 bullets for my handgun and plenty for the shotgun too. This isn't necessarily a bad thing since Silent Hill has no inventory management like Resident Evil, but I find that it kind of screws with the balance of the game at times. And once all of the tablets have been collected, it is time for the next puzzle, which is pretty easy all things considered. Inside the nurse center is a door with the slots for the tablets, and a piece of paper just to the left of it. The paper talks about a bunch of different things that don't seem to be connected at all, but it's pretty obvious what it's talking about. Each line refers to a different color. The first line talks about clouds, so that color is white. The second mentions the sky, so the color is blue. It goes on and on like that, but the only colors you need to know are the second, fourth, sixth, and eighth colors, as the ones in between have already been placed on the door. So, putting the tablets in the order of blue, green, yellow, and red will unlock the door. The final line on the paper is a particularly dark one, as the poem is pretty tame for the most part, but then the final line reads as, "Liquid flowing from a slashed wrist." Pretty dark end to a nice poem, I'd say. But now we've been granted access to the second half of the second floor, and the main pickups here are a basement storage key and some disinfecting alcohol. So obviously the next stop is to the basement, where you'll find a pretty dark and messed up secret. Behind a cabinet in the storeroom is a secret door that leads to an entirely different part of the hospital. Unfortunately, there is a gate that is tangled in roots, keeping us from being able to progress. Using a lighter and the alcohol found in the previous room, Harry can burn the roots that are keeping the gate locked. Heading down below the passageway that you just opened up allows you to enter an entirely new part of the area. This part of the hospital feels more like some kind of prison and is a major clue to the horrors that happened in Silent Hill. The area feels darker, the music becomes more distorted, and rooms feel more claustrophobic. One of the main items down here is a blood-covered videotape that you can use on the TV up on the third floor to get some extra story tidbits. But that isn't all that's down here, as a few other rooms are accessible too. One room has a jump scare where the sound of smashing glass is repeated over and over again. It isn't much, but it certainly is effective. And another doorway leads you to a tiny hospital room with a portrait of a young girl named Delessa on the bedside table. Beside the portrait is the examination room key, which is the place we need to go next, but going up to the TV first is recommended. You don't get much out of the tape, but you can make out that a nurse is describing the wounds found on a child, and she's clearly in distress. But for now, that's that's all we're gonna get out of the tape. Mysteriously, the VCR becomes broken after you use it this one time, but the tape stays in our inventory, indicating that it'll likely still be useful later on. But now we have to head down to the examination room on the first floor, and this will introduce us to the next major character of the game, Lisa Garland. She is just as confused as Harry is, and the only other person in the game who actually seems scared about what's going on here. As expected, she also has no idea where Cheryl is, and she also has no idea about what's in the basement. Lisa is also probably the only other character in the game that speaks like a normal person. I don't even think Sybil sounds right half the time, so yeah. It's also nice just to hear Lisa sound like an actual human being and not a weird, creepy person keeping secrets. She couldn't be keeping secrets, right? There's no way that could happen. Surely there's no way. After talking with Lisa, Harry passes out for some reason and wakes back up in the real world with no sign of Lisa around. Instead, Harry wakes back up to the crazy woman again, and she talks about random inane shit again, which Harry does not understand. Honestly, neither do I. She gives Harry a key. Well, actually no, she could have given Harry a key, but instead she puts it on the table next to her. I mean, don't strain yourself or anything. Don't hand me the key. Just put it next to you. It's really helpful, thanks. But anyway, that marks the end of the hospital section for now. Examining the key that she leaves behind will show you that it belongs to a shop called the Green Lion, which is up at the northern end of central Silent Hill. This trek also introduces a new element of the soundscape, a sort of screeching and high-pitched sound that's very, very unnerving to listen to. This instance is just another case of the game layering on different elements of sound that all add to the ambient fear. The crazy thing about this backing track is that I think it's only present on New Game Plus, which made me kind of go a little crazy on a replay for this video because I did not remember that sound at all the first time I played through the game. But anyway, once you get to the Green Lion antique store, you may recognize it from the brief scene where a young girl walked into the store. I guess the scene is supposed to be a clue for where to go next, but I doubt that. Entering the store doesn't really seem to be anything special, but pushing the cabinet at the back of the room reveals a hidden tunnel. Sybil also shows up again and she tells Harry that she actually saw Cheryl, but couldn't reach her because she was walking on thin air. Harry is obviously a little pissed that Sybil didn't manage to catch Cheryl, but hey, what are you gonna do? Cheryl was apparently walking towards the lake, so there's the next clue for where she may be. But for whatever reason, Harry wants to enter this tunnel more than he wants to go and find Cheryl? That's a bit weird, but alright. Sybil offers to enter the tunnel instead of Harry since she's the cop and probably should be the one to throw themselves into strange dark antique shop tunnels, but then Harry yells a tiny bit and she backs down. This is a great scene as well because Harry actually talks about what he's seen to Sybil. He obviously thinks he's crazy, and it's the first time we've been able to see Harry discuss these feelings with another sane person. It's an interesting moment of vulnerability for Harry, and much needed after he's been pretty quiet about some of the crazy stuff he's seen so far. Proceeding through the tunnel eventually takes Harry to an altar, and this very strange looking photograph of what appears to be some kind of chicken wearing a Roman helmet made out of blood. I would love to know what this is supposed to be, so if you actually do know, I would love it if you hit me up on Twitter or in the comments below. I have no idea what this is meant to represent. But there isn't really anything else to do here apart from picking up the axe that's hanging on the wall. It's not that great as a weapon though, and I basically never use it. The range is awful in comparison to the hammer, and it doesn't really do that much damage either from what I can tell, so I almost never use it. But since that's it, we can leave now, and that's the moment when the altar lights up. Sybil then enters the tunnel, and Harry has disappeared. I do really want to quickly take this moment to really commend the game's use of the camera sometimes. There are various moments in the game where the camera behaves in vaguely strange ways, like staying in a static position as Harry moves down a narrow corridor, or when it changes to an over-the-shoulder perspective. These moments are rare in the game, but they add a lot to the overall scene when they do happen. It's a tasteful use of the 3D camera in a game where they could have gone overboard with that freedom. Instead, they only play around with the camera when it fits the tone of what's happening on screen. But the weirdness continues when Harry wakes up in the hospital beside Lisa once again. But the entire tone of this scene is bizarre. Lisa seems disconnected and much calmer than she did before. She also knows a lot more about the history of the town, and it's queer religion. She explains that the town used to be the location of an ultra-religious cult before it eventually became a resort for tourists. The screen then abruptly cuts to black before Harry wakes up in a completely different place in the other world, standing in the dark, twisted version of the antique store. And once Harry gets to the streets again, it's an even more fucked up place than it was before. The entire street has been replaced with a steel grate, and the ape men are running all over the place. My worst nightmare. The goal now is to head back to the hospital to see if Lisa can tell Harry anything else about what's going on here. But every way out of the area is blocked off, with the only exit being found in the town center. Honestly, the game feels like it's rushing a bit here, and the pacing begins to feel a little weird. We just left the hospital after all, and it feels weird to be going back there already. Whether that's an entirely intentional feeling, or an indication that the game is running out of things to show, is down to your personal interpretation, I guess. To me at least, it feels like the reusing of areas happens a little too quickly, especially when you consider what the last area of the game is supposed to be. As soon as Harry enters the town center, a video begins to mysteriously play, which showcases Cheryl seemingly in pain and wondering where Harry is, interspersed with very strange symbols and brief flashes of Alessa. And if you can't already tell, this is where the game starts to get very, very weird. Harry then encounters the next boss fight against Twin Feeler. I don't like that name. I don't like it. I also don't really like this boss. Twin Feeler is a giant bug that digs underground and appears on the surface to attack Harry. It's pretty easy to figure out how to damage it, just shoot it when it emerges and run away when it gets too close. The most annoying part of the fight is when Harry just refuses to lock on sometimes, leading to you wasting ammo, which can be pretty annoying, especially if you're using the shotgun or the new weapon in the area, the rifle. One of the most powerful weapons in the game, but one that should be used sparingly since ammo is a little more rare for it. After shooting it for a while, it finally flees through the door and allows us to continue our journey to the hospital. And yeah, that's it. It's kind of underwhelming, but it's there you go. Outside now, a new enemy is revealed. It's just a very buff version of the flying things from earlier, but now the flapping sounds of the wings are more obnoxious. This is also where you can see how drastically the area has changed, with the massive spinning fans now being present instead of the buildings you would expect to see. Honestly, not really sure what this is supposed to add, but it's a very cool visual, so hey, it's good. I like it. It's very good. This is also the point in the game where a lack of visibility is sort of made into a mechanic. And by that, I mean the area is so dark here that you physically cannot see where you can and can't go, save for the few precious meters in front of you. What this means is that you'll most likely be walking through this area while rubbing up on all of the invisible walls to try and see where you can go. This in itself is not a challenge, but when you're being chased by zombie dogs, flying birdmen, and the occasional ape man, it can be a little stressful. The factory/smelting beat in the background also adds to the stress by being a weirdly banging track for what is essentially factory sound effects. What's worse is that the quickest way to the hospital is now devoid of any actual roads, so to get back, we need to take the long way around while dodging all of the enemies. But eventually, you do reach the hospital and reunite with Lisa, who is way more cheery now, like she was earlier. She tells Harry about a way to get to the lake through the sewers. Lisa then begs Harry to not go and says some very weird stuff about feeling like she can't leave the hospital. She's clearly distressed and in need of some help. So what does Harry do? He just leaves. He just leaves, and the camera just stays on Lisa as she comes to terms with being scared and alone again. What the fuck? Harry, what the hell? As I'm sure we're all used to by now with how this game likes to change up areas, upon leaving the hospital, the area has changed once again, with only a narrow walkway now being accessible, which leads to a fire escape, and also, consequently, to the next boss fight. This time, we're fighting a giant moth, and I only just figured out, when writing this video, that Twin Feeler left the previous fight and turned into this giant moth. Before, I thought that a moth had randomly appeared for no reason, but hey, never mind. I guess there was a reason. But see, now I'm wondering why the fuck we were fighting a caterpillar shortly before it began the chrysalis stage of its life, which it apparently had finished in about 20 minutes. Now, so far, the fights have been kinda mundane and not really all that difficult, but this is one of the first fights in the game that can be kinda tricky if you aren't careful. It's hard to keep space from it because of how quickly it can move back over to you. Plus, it can do a lot of damage with its poison spit attack and its little stab, so it can be pretty tough if you're short on items. I haven't really got any good advice for this fight other than to make sure you do have a lot of good items, and you basically never want to stop shooting it, is what I found. But once it's done, we're back in the good old fog-covered streets of Silent Hill, and free to go to the next area. Though the bizarre thing that happens is that as soon as you travel back to old Silent Hill, it instantly places you right outside of where you need to go. Not that I'm complaining, it eliminates unnecessary backtracking, it just feels so strangely nice that this game has decided to just do that. This is also the only instance in any survival horror game I've played where the solution to unlocking a door is actually by shooting the lock. So for that alone, this game gets a 10 out of 10. But here begins the dreaded sewer level, and to be completely honest with you, it isn't actually that bad. In fact, this might be one of the nicer sewer levels that I've played in my lifetime, and I'll tell you why. First up, the actual layout of the sewer isn't all that complicated. You've either got these long tunnels or the actual drainage areas where you can only walk on one side or the other. Then, almost every dead end actually rewards you with health items and ammo, which takes the sting out of getting lost a little bit. They even give you a map which shows you how simple these areas are, and the best part is that it doesn't even take that long, like I'm talking 15 minutes tops. I guess this game also kicked off a trend in Silent Hill for sticking your hand into very disgusting places that you should absolutely not be sticking your hand into, but we'll get more into that with Silent Hill 2. There's if you know, you know. But once we have left the sewers, we are presented with the last open area of the game, the resort/lakeside amusement park. This is also where the ending can once again be influenced. Traveling to the various locations in the resort will allow you to run into Kaufman again, this time acting much shadier than before. Eventually, these encounters will take you to the motel, where in the garage, you can find a motorbike. Inside the bike is a small glass vial filled with a red liquid called, aglofotis. Aglofotis? Aglofotis. We'll say aglofotis. That sounds about right. Like the one found back in the hospital. Kaufman then storms in and steals it back from Harry and leaves once again. Believe it or not, this is how you trigger the good ending. But in order to get the best ending possible, there is still one more thing that we have to do later on. Proceeding to the lake, Harry is once again dragged back into the other world, but this time it happens right before his eyes, which is the first time this shift has happened in such a way, since usually the game has some clever way of hiding the transition. But after walking through the area, Harry eventually stumbles on a boat at the pier, sauntering past the massive rotting corpse that's just past the entrance of the ship. I guess Harry is just used to that at this point. Can I blame him? I don't know. Harry once again meets Sybil here and tries to convince her that the other world is slowly taking over Silent Hill. And the old lady, we now know as Dahlia Gillespie, comes in as well to confirm what Harry has said. Dahlia reveals that Cheryl is going to be a sacrifice for the demon that is causing all of these events to happen. She then tells Harry to go to the lighthouse in order to stop them. This entire area is probably where most of the issues with the controls comes into play. There are so many narrow bridges and areas that you have to carefully navigate so that Harry doesn't constantly run into a wall. They also throw tons of enemies at you that can either block the way or swoop in out of nowhere to land a few good hits on you. This area isn't too bad if you're well adjusted to the clunkiness of the game, but for those who struggle with tank controls on a good day, well, you might start to hate this area pretty quickly. Luckily though, the lighthouse isn't too far away, and I do just want to commend the game for a minute because these might be one of the hardest staircases to walk up in the entire series. This small area also communicates the idea that we're about to walk into a boss fight. It's pretty obvious due to the save point right as you walk in, and with the ominous foreboding music as you walk up the stairs. And once you get up to the top, there is no boss fight, just the young girl seen earlier in the game, and that's it. She just leaves, and now we have to leave the area and go back to the boat. But since no one else is at the boat, the goal now is to get to the amusement park to hopefully catch up with everyone else. But since the road is blocked, or rather non-existent, I mean, why would it be? Who needs roads, alright? Harry has to use another sewer entrance located near the road. Upon entering the sewer, we see a small cutscene of Sybil being sneaky before being knocked over on the ground like a chump. The sewers basically work in the same way as it did just now, but now everything looks slightly more fucked up. There's also a new enemy in the form of these weird sloth-looking things. They're basically just the children with knives from earlier, but now they look like sloths. This area is also even simpler than before, because you just need to go in 3 straight lines and that's it. But now we're at the amusement park and oh my god, it's horrifying. So there's a bunch of children with knives running around and many of the rides are just running by themselves, and yeah, I don't like this. It's also pretty hard to find your way around because of how dark it is, but eventually you'll come across a carousel. And here is where the next boss fight takes place, against Sybil. Now this fight can actually be pretty tough since she does a ton of damage with her gun. The best advice I have for this fight is to make sure you have plenty of health items and to stay away from Sybil. It only takes a couple of shots for her to kill you, so it's better to be safe than sorry. Once you've dealt enough damage to her, she'll throw her gun away and begin the second phase. Now she'll start walking towards you, but this is pretty easy to deal with. Just back away and keep shooting her. Or, if you want to get the best possible ending, you could use the red liquid you found in the hospital on her. This will free her of the mind control stuff and bring her back to your side. Otherwise, you'll just end up killing her and be on track to getting a slightly worse ending. And I do say slightly worse, the ending doesn't really change all that much. Saving Sybil also allows Harry to reveal to her that Cheryl isn't actually his biological daughter. Instead, he found her on the side of the road like the opening implied. This is actually really important information, and something you don't find out if you kill Sybil. You just kind of have to assume it, I guess. But it's never outrightly said anywhere else in the game, and it's neat that it's only in this optional cutscene. After this encounter, you once again meet the young girl who this time attacks Harry. Though, by using the rusty 3D shit-stained Triforce, Harry manages to stun and weaken her. Dahlia then shows up and reveals what's really going on here. The young girl is actually Alessa Gillespie, the daughter of Dahlia. Alessa was trying to get away from Dahlia because of how culty she is, for lack of a better term. Dahlia used Harry to track down and eventually catch Alessa for her, and there's still no sign of Cheryl either. The two then seem to teleport somewhere else as the screen fades to black. Harry wakes up in the hospital again with this extremely creepy little scene. Lisa's eye twitching here really freaks me out sometimes. Lisa reveals that she went to the basement and feels like she knows what happened down there, but she can't remember anything. She's also acting strangely like she was earlier. She then leaves and Harry hears something coming from the basement. This starts the final dungeon of the game, Nowhere. And it isn't really an area at all. It gets weird. This place is composed of rooms from every other dungeon in the game, from the school and hospital to smaller places like the antique store. Now, you could absolutely view this as a kind of lazy reuse of assets, and I do sort of agree with that, but narratively it also has some special significance. Alright, I'm going to try to attempt to lore dump this game as best as I can, just so we have a frame of reference for going into the ending. So strap in, strap on once again, and I apologize in advance. The reason that Silent Hill is the way that it is because of Alessa's nightmares. Dahlia had basically forced Alessa to pray to and believe in the beliefs of their cult. The basic belief was that there is a paradise free from evil, corruption, and greed, blah blah blah. Of course, if you tell any child that, they'll probably start to believe in it, but Dahlia was extremely cruel to Alessa on top of that, and so were the kids at her school, Midwich Elementary. Alessa was chosen by the cult of Silent Hill to be the Mother of God, and as a part of some twisted ritual, she was also the victim of a fire started by Dahlia in her own home, and she suffered 4th-degree burns as a result. After this, Alessa had to be kept in the basement of Alchemilla Hospital so that no one would know where she was, and she had Lisa appointed as her personal nurse by director Kaufman. Then, at some point, Alessa had been able to split her soul in half, the other half being Cheryl, which allowed that part of her to live a happy life, while the half that was still Alessa had to remain in her body and stay as a victim of the Order. After 7 years though, Alessa had a plan to ruin what Dahlia had in mind. She called Cheryl back to Silent Hill, and once the two had become one again, she would kill herself before God could be born. This is why we see Alessa during the opening of the game, as it was her projection that was on the road that caused the crash. When Cheryl did return to her, Alessa enshrouded Silent Hill in fog, and the creatures from her nightmares became reality, infesting the town and splitting it into 2 different realities. What we can guess is the real world, but one covered in fog, and the other world, one that exists as a nightmare. As her power became stronger, the town became more and more twisted and distorted. This is why the game starts to get crazier as time goes on. It's also why we end up retreading the steps of Alessa's life, but we don't understand her perspective on all this until we begin exploring Nowhere. Now, when it comes to the gameplay in this dungeon, this place is a fucking mess, and it all comes down to one thing: There is no map, which makes sense since every room is just a jumbled up one from different parts of the game, but my god is this place confusing sometimes. It's alright really, since there aren't too many rooms to go to honestly, and the ones you do need to pay attention to are marked. But if you lose track of where you are, it can be very tricky to get yourself back on track. But this area is also home to some of the better puzzles in the game, so it's all okay. One of the first rooms you'll find is this empty classroom that has only one desk, and if you interact with the desk, you'll see that there are tons of markings that say some pretty messed up stuff like drop dead or thief. This is Alessa's desk and shows what her mental state was during her time in school. In the next room we can find pliers and a screwdriver needed for progression. The pliers are used to pull the key of Ophiel out of a tap, which is one of the marked doors we need to enter through. And this door will take us to our first puzzle in the area, and one that's actually pretty easy. On one wall is the Grim Reaper's list with a bunch of names and ages on it. Opposite it is a panel with each letter of the alphabet written on it. The solution here is to input the first initial of each name in the order of youngest to oldest. Doing this spells out the word alert, which doesn't have any significance as far as I'm aware. I think it seems like it's a coincidence that it spells that word out, but I think it's interesting how it is an actual word, I guess. As far as I can tell, there is zero significance to the word alert, but it's a word. Doing this gives you the Amulet of Solomon, one of the items that we need to finish the dungeon. On the way out though, we run into Lisa again, but something really isn't right. Lisa realizes what's going on and has a crisis. She says that she's the same as the other nurses we've seen, and she goes to hug Harry for comfort. And then this classic scene begins to play. I think what really makes this a tragedy is that we never really got to know who Lisa was. She was the one who helped us throughout the game, and for her to die as suddenly and unexpectedly as that is a shock in more ways than one. I also love that entering the room reveals that there's no one there. So was Lisa a figment of Harry's mind? What was she? Was she dreamt up by Alessa? I guess the real sad thing here is that we never get an answer to any of this. But now we've got our second puzzle to solve in a room just up ahead, and in here there are a bunch of portraits with animals, and beneath each of these pictures is a number. Now I'm not afraid to admit that it took me a long time to figure out what this meant the first time I played this game, and to be honest, it's very simple. I don't know how I didn't get it. At the far end of the room there are 3 panels that don't have a number on it. You simply have to choose the correct number for the portraits here, and again, it's very easy. You just take note of how many limbs each one has, and that's the number for each portrait. So the cow has 4, the centaur has 6, and the 2 children have 8. I am embarrassed that it took me as long to figure out as it did. Nowhere is a pretty grindy place when it comes down to it, and there is a lot of trial and error when it comes to figuring out where to go on a first playthrough. But the basic way to play it is to just try every door you see, and try your best to memorize the layouts of each hallway. It gets especially confusing once you gain access to the elevator and can reach different floors, because there are rooms that lead to entirely different floors as well. One of the rooms on the second floor takes you back to the hallway on the first floor, for example, which can make things extremely confusing. And you don't even have that kind of floor structure there to help you navigate the place. The next puzzle in the game is probably my favorite one because, I don't know, I like shapes. On the third floor there are 2 portraits, and by using a camera found in a previous room, Harry can use the flash to reveal 3 shapes on each portrait. The panels behind Harry also come in pairs of 3. Pairs of 3? Pairs of 3? The idea here is that you use the buttons on these panels to replicate each of the shapes. Very good puzzle, very good puzzle, big fan, really, it's good. Here you'll find a key needed to unlock the bird cage down on the first floor, or is it up on the first floor? I don't know. Nowhere confuses the shit out of me. You'll also find a book that goes more into what the White Claudia drug actually is. It's a plant that has hallucinogenic properties and was used primarily in religious ceremonies. It's also the drug that was dealt in Silent Hill, and by connecting the dots with the evidence we found in the Silent Hill resort, we can conclude that Kaufman was the one that was dealing the drug for the cult. Anyway, back to the room with the birdcage and no bird, even though there are flapping sounds. Okay. I actually love this because when you take the key, the flapping sounds just stop. So like, was it the key making those sounds, or is the invisible bird now supremely pissed at you for taking his key? Using this key, you can once again enter the basement of the hospital, even though it technically isn't a basement anymore when you aren't under the ground floor, but hey, you know what? Fuck it. This is also an area that features an insta-kill, but you have to work pretty hard to actually get killed by it. In the kitchen, there is a massive cabinet with a dagger poking out of it. Harry remarks that there is a broken chain, and then the game asks if you want to pull out the sword. It even plays this ominous as hell sound when it gives you this option, as if it's staring you in the face and daring you to do it. If you actually do take it out, a tentacle monster will grab you and you'll die. But if you have the Ring of Contract, Harry can use that to reseal the door and grab the dagger safely. Another room is the attic that Alessa was locked in, filled with markings and a projection of her crying underneath a table. It's a pretty messed up place once you know its relevance. There's also another room featuring a TV that we can use to play our videotape from earlier, only this time there is no static interfering with it. It reveals a video of Lisa describing the wounds that Alessa had, and she's seemingly begging to someone to let her free from her care. Another room is based on her room from the hospital, and there is a projection of the cult discussing Alessa's situation. They explain that Alessa's soul has been split from her body, and that they will need to wait for her soul to recombine. It also confirms that Kaufman was indeed a member of this cult, and equally to blame for the events that transpired in this town. The final room is Alessa's bedroom, and it is also one of the final rooms of the game before the final boss. Interestingly, this room seems pretty normal, all things considered. Using the items that were scattered around nowhere, Harry can unlock the final door. And through this door is one last projection of Dahlia and Alessa, where Dahlia is trying to force Alessa to participate in the ritual, showing just how cruel and cold she really was to her own daughter. And these rooms, by the way, are actually from Alessa's house, the one that we see in the intro for just a few seconds. The game never actually connects the two, but there you go. I guess it was confirmed somehow. A scene then plays out that can change very slightly if Sybil is dead at this point, but if she is here, she'll have Dahlia at gunpoint before being flung away. Then Harry confronts Dahlia, and she finally reveals the truth to him about Cheryl and Alessa, that the two have now formed into one being called the Incubator. She then reveals that the new god is about to be born, and here is where the actions made for the ending take effect. If you didn't find the motorbike during the Kaufman side quest, you'll need to kill Alessa and consequently Cheryl. This is the bad ending, if you couldn't tell. It's also easy to tell because of how much easier it is versus the good ending's fight against the Incubus. The bad ending leaves Harry distraught over the death of Cheryl, and it ends right there, with Harry alone in the crumbling ruins of the otherworld. If you saved Sybil earlier, she'll try to console Harry, and then the camera pans out. But if you didn't save her, then Harry really does just stay there, and presumably dies alone. The good ending is far more hopeful, and, well, good. This time around, the ritual is interrupted by Kaufman, who appears and throws a Glophodus? Is that what we're doing? Okay, a Glophodus onto Alessa, but instead of killing her like his plan presumably was, it actually ends up quickening the process somehow, causing a being called the Incubus to appear, which is the true final boss of the game. Immediately, the vibe here is much darker and more sinister than the fight against the Incubator, with the infamous song that plays, really making this moment feel overwhelming and deeply uncomfortable. Hilariously, both the Incubator and the Incubus decide to kill Dahlia right at the start, so I guess everyone just hates her that much. Now, this boss is a lot tougher since it attacks far more frequently and does a lot more damage, so really the tactic here is to keep running around while shooting it with the hunting rifle. If you don't have many health items or much in the way of ammo, this fight can be a pain in the ass. Luckily, thanks to the game's amazing checkpoint system for boss fights, losing to it isn't so painful. The boss itself is also really interesting, and hold on to your seats because we're about to dig into some lore again. The true nature of this boss isn't ever truly disclosed. Dahlia commonly refers to this as the god of their cult, as a being named Samael, but it seems pretty unlikely that this thing is an actual god, and it's more than likely an interpretation of God that both Dahlia and Alessa share. After all, the monsters in Silent Hill are conjured up from Alessa's nightmares, and it would make sense if this creature was a result of that as well. From that perspective, I think that this fight has so much more meaning. Rather than simply killing a god and saving the day, the fight between Harry and the Incubus is much deeper than that. This is a father trying to erase the nightmare that has been plaguing his daughter throughout the game. It's a moment that solidifies Harry as the father and guardian of both Cheryl and Alessa, even if he doesn't fully realize it. And to me, this is a much more satisfying final confrontation from this point of view. It's the perfect final note on Harry's journey of trying to save Cheryl. This culminates in the defeat of the Incubus and the reappearance of the Incubator, who calls out to Harry one last time. Splitting her soul once again, she gives Harry a baby and marks the end of both Alessa and Cheryl as she gives life to something brand new instead. She then points towards a light which is Harry's ticket out of the other world. The thing I love here is that Harry doesn't even look back for Sybil if she's still alive, and he just decides to fuck off entirely. And Kaufman is here too in the good ending, but instead of escaping with Harry and Sybil, Lisa appears one last time and pulls him back, getting some revenge for the things that he forced her to do and trapping him in the other world for all of eternity. As Harry and Sybil make their way out, they are almost crushed by something until the Incubator saves them and allows them to continue their escape. The music here is beautiful and has such a somber tone, but one that also feels sort of relaxing in a strange way. Making it back onto the fog-covered streets of Silent Hill, the game then fades to the credits, and we have finally beaten Silent Hill 1. What follows from there is a hilarious casting reel where we once again see all of the characters playing out their CG intros from the game, but now they are messing up or having fun with each other like you'd see in an outtake reel for a film. I love this stuff so much because it's such a fun way to end the game after the pretty dark and harrowing stuff we've seen so far. Though, again, PS1 CG just kind of has a creepy vibe to it, so even this still manages to be kind of creepy. After you've beaten the game, you are introduced to a results screen that shows you just how bad at the game you truly are. It also shows you how many of the secret items you've unlocked, but we'll get to that entire thing in a minute. The CG opening of the game is also slightly different now, since after getting the Good Plus ending where Sybil survives, she is replacing Harry's dead wife from the regular opening, which is honestly kind of weird, but it's also kind of cool. Silent Hill still has quite a few secrets left to uncover even after you've beaten the game for the first time. Like most survival horror games of the time, there's still quite a bit of replay value here for those that want it. The first and most obvious few things are the brand new weapons that you unlock after beating the game once with any ending. The first two weapons are a chainsaw and a rock drill. The chainsaw can be found in Cut-Right Chainsaws in Old Silent Hill, and the rock drill can be found underneath the bridge control room. The catch is that you need to find gasoline in the gas station to power them, but there's only one gas can, so you can only have one or the other in a playthrough. Neither of these weapons are all that great though, to be honest, and I never really use them on replays either. The hammer is a far better melee weapon most of the time. You can unlock the katana. Located in the house on Levin Street, this thing is cool. Doesn't matter how useful it is, it's a goddamn katana, so that's a win in my book. The last big thing to uncover is the final ending. Once you beat the game once, you can find a strange item called the Channeling Stone in the convenience store. Taking the stone to 5 different locations will each reveal a UFO in the sky, and it eventually culminates in an ending where aliens land in Silent Hill. And, well, here you go. Just watch it.
Sorry. Let me ask you, have you seen a little girl around here? Short, black hair.
The song here is very good too. It's such a fun secret to have in a game that's normally pretty dark. Super fun to have and absolutely worth playing through the game again to get. You also gain a weapon called the Hyper Blaster, a light gun with infinite ammo but pretty low damage. There are 3 different Hyper Blasters in the game, and by doing the UFO ending, you get the red one, which is the weakest. Beating the game with a 10-star ranking will upgrade the gun to use the green beam, which is the strongest one. The last thing to cover here is a bit of a weird inclusion, to be honest, and I wasn't really sure if I was going to talk about this, but here we go. If you go to the options menu, you can bring up a secret menu by pressing one of the shoulder buttons. I realize it isn't all that secret if one press takes you to it, but still. Here you can mess with things like the color of blood, you know, in case the color red is a little too violent, I guess. All this other stuff though, no, it's fine. There's a self-view mode, which changes the camera control button to an over-the-shoulder view, which is kind of useless, but also kind of cool. There's also a bullet adjust option that lets you set how much more ammo you get from ammo pickups. So if for some reason you feel like the game didn't provide you with enough ammo, you can fix that problem yourself. This stuff is a weird inclusion, but also really cool at the same time. There are just a few little things that can help you to tweak the experience even more. Well, we did it. We got to the end of Silent Hill. I'm really glad I ended up making this video because it helped me get a much more solid opinion on the game. And the very first thing I want to talk about here in this section is the storyline. And the storyline is probably one of the more underwhelming parts of the game. Not because the premise is bad or anything like that, but mainly because the entire thing kind of feels half-baked. It's all because there's so little to latch onto. The mystery of Alessa and Cheryl is only slightly delved into, and we really don't get to know much about those characters and their goals and motivations. And we barely know what was actually done to them to create this entire mess that we're in to begin with. In fact, most of the cool things that do happen in this storyline are things that you kind of have to infer through subtext and vague clues. I think for me, the story nails certain emotional beats, like with Harry's final confrontation against the Incubus and the Incubator, and with the final moments of the good ending as well. But as a whole package, there really isn't too much to latch onto here. The story is about a cult that did some weird shit, there are monsters running around, and there's fog everywhere. That's really kind of it. I think the gameplay in Silent Hill 1 is most likely going to be one of the more contested things when talking about this game. In my opinion, I think the controls actually worked really, really well. It feels less stiff than some of the earlier RE games, and I rarely had a problem with the way that Harry controlled here. Mind you, I think there are absolutely issues here. The amount of times I smacked Harry into a wall or accidentally did a move that I didn't want to, like, it got annoying for sure. But for the most part, it controls really well, especially with the context that this was one of the very first fully 3D PS1 survival horror games. And I'm gonna give it a lot of slack for that. I think it does a really good job considering that. Hell, the ability to walk back and shoot at the same time makes so many situations easier, and you don't even really notice it. Bosses like the Split Head would be so annoying if I couldn't simply walk backwards while shooting. And being able to gain some distance from enemies while you're preparing a melee attack or preparing to shoot really makes some situations infinitely easier and more fun. And on the topic of bosses, they're fine. They're okay. They're mediocre. I mean, they're Silent Hill boss fights, and for the most part, I think Silent Hill boss fights are painless. They're fine. I could do an entire video essay itself on how much I really do not like survival horror boss fights anyway, but I would take a mediocre boss fight over one that is annoying and bad. What I'll say about the boss fights here are that they feel like they're there to mostly pad out the game time, but some fights like the Incubus or the Split Head are fun enough to get you by. But for things I liked, I absolutely loved the level design in this game. Each area feels so different and offers up completely different kinds of experiences. The school is a great first dungeon that offers up some cool puzzles and a simple structure that makes exploration easy to do. The hospital is a good step up that presents you with a more complex layout with interesting things to find. And while nowhere is a fucking mess and can be extremely annoying to explore, it also provides a unique challenge that can mess with you in a completely different way to all of the other areas. The town of Silent Hill itself was a little bit disappointing to me in its execution, like I mentioned earlier on in the video. But for what it is and it being the first game in the series, I think that the actual town itself was really impressive. I especially love the concept of this sort of semi-open world-ish horror game. And we kind of saw this idea being continued in other Silent Hill games, but also in games like The Evil Within 2, which also has this sort of open world concept. I wish the map here was even more expansive and let you explore even more places because it's such a cool, unique idea. But For what it is here, I think it's fine. I think it's serviceable, and I think it gives you just enough to explore to make the world constantly feel interesting. And finally, the last thing to cover, the scares. Is Silent Hill still a scary game? That's hard to answer really, but for me, I'll say yes, it still feels like a scary game. The ambience in the game is masterful, and how hopeless and creepy it all feels. The look and feel of the town when it's set in both the daytime with the foggy streets and the other world with the pitch black lighting, they both just feel so spooky and cool in their own ways. And then the environments like the school, hospital, and amusement park each just feel so creepy in their own ways. The sound design does a lot of heavy lifting here though, to be completely honest. The soundtrack, for example, does a lot to make certain moments feel anxiety-inducing when there isn't even anything on screen to be scared of. The few jump scares in the game also feel well set up and built up to. The locker room jump scare in the school, for example, where in the original version of the school you find the cat, and then in the other world the locker is stained with blood, and on the way out of the room a body falls out of a completely different locker. That one actually got me. It's really good. In closing, to me, this game really, really holds up because of its ambience alone, and the things that it does as a horror game that just feels so cool and timeless. If you came to this video wondering whether or not Silent Hill is a game that's worth revisiting or playing for the first time, absolutely yes. Sure, the overall storyline is weak and the gameplay can be kind of fiddly at times, but I still absolutely believe that this is an experience that you really should give a go. The first Silent Hill game is a title that I think needs to be played by more and more people. I think it needs to be played by as many people as possible and should never ever be forgotten about, even amidst its sequels, which are both brilliant and terrible in their own right. Silent Hill 1 is going to be a game that will always stick with me as this really ambitious and cool first step in a franchise that soared to amazingly high heights and some pretty low lows. But for now, Harry Mason's time in Silent Hill is done, and just over the horizon is a man looking for his dead wife in the town of Silent Hill. And until then, I'll see you in Silent Hill 2.